In this video, I want to expand on my earlier previous video, which talked about the position of the federal government. And one of the key aspects of the government's defense is to say that the case Westbury v. Sanders from 1964 does not apply to issues of interstate apportionment. Again, in a previous video, I described that Westbury dealt with districts within the state of Georgia and how they were being apportioned and divided up among the different voters in the state. And the Westbury case dealt with that issue. But all of the rhetoric and all of the historical and constitutional background and source data that Westbury pulled talked about it didn't demarcate or distinguish between interstate and intrastate, but the federal government contends that it just applies to intrastate, and that's all the Constitution requires relative to equality. And we, of course, argue in our brief that that position is not accurate. But interestingly, Westbury was mentioned in 5 cases going from 1992 through 2002. So there's 5 different cases, 1992 to 2002, that specifically refer to Westbury. And the case that most closely resembles Clemens v. Department of Commerce, the current lawsuit that's in play, is Montana. And what's interesting about what the Supreme Court said in Montana is that Westbury is actually a standard that can be used to evaluate whether apportionment is appropriate. In fact, they make a statement that's very important. They say that based on the evidence that was presented in the Montana case, that they did not see any violation of the Westbury standard, but that this notion of a one person, one vote, if the right kind of case was presented, would in fact be justiciable. It would be reviewable by the court. But in Montana's case, which I'll mention in a moment, Montana didn't meet their burden of proof. And I'll talk about why that was the case. So Montana was 1992, and then there were 4 other Supreme Court cases, which you can, again, reference on our website at apportionment.us, or you can see specifically in our briefs how we address those. But let me just summarize it by saying this. Westbury absolutely commands a one person, one vote. But what's interesting in these 5 different suits that came forward, they either dealt with issues of the census, how the Department of the Census was counting people, what methods and models and assumptions and factors and so forth that they were using. And in Montana's case, it was which mathematical model the government or Congress decided to use to apportion representatives according to population. And what we summarize this is these are secondary issues. What kind of discretion Congress can use to pick whatever model they want to use is something the Constitution doesn't enumerate. So there is discretion for them to pick a model according to population and use it consistently. And in the case of the census, the Department of the Census, Department of Commerce, has some flexibility, quite honestly. They've got some discretion with how they want to count people. Now, there's certain guidelines even in that case, but what plaintiffs were doing is coming forward and saying the Westbury standard of one person, one vote should apply to these detailed, I call secondary or mechanical, logistical aspects. But it's clear that the overarching point, which is a primary thrust, is that the House of Representatives ought to be apportioned according to population. And back to Westbury, equal numbers of people, equal representation. And that's the standard of Westbury, which Montana very clearly said they didn't see a violation of the Westbury standard. But the government simply says Westbury does not apply. And of course they're going to say that because they know that if it does apply, and that if one person, one vote is constitutionally required, which we believe it is, then the government doesn't have a leg to stand on when you try to justify these massive, massive amounts of inequity. In fact, something's really interesting about this topic called the incorporation doctrine. Some of you may have heard of that. A incorporation doctrine is simply that it took provisions based upon the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which happened in the 1860s. It took the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and what it did is it incorporated a number of aspects of the Bill of Rights to be binding on the states. So what you have now is a federal government that's really doing the reverse. What they're saying is not only states, you have to abide by all these provisions which originally were architected for the federal government to adhere to. And I think the incorporation doctrine's fine. But what you have now is the federal government saying, well, states, you have to follow all of these provisions and regulations and policies and processes, but in this case of one person, one vote, the federal government says we don't have to abide by it. And that is just simply wrong. The government has no moral authority to say that Mississippi or South Dakota or Texas or any state has to follow one person, one vote when they themselves don't think it's important enough to follow. And once again, let's not lose the fact that we are talking about American voters. These are people who work, who sacrifice, who pay taxes, and who have a constitutional right to vote. And they're being disenfranchised. And this is fixable. It's preventable. Remedies exist. And we're asking the court to mandate that the federal government follow what they're asking the states to follow. And that's why the Westbury Standard, in our opinion, and we think we have history and the Constitution and case law behind us, does apply and should be followed. Thank you.